Pat, did you and Art get all the dope on our new route van the other day?
We got the principles, Ralph. But Tex said he'd tell us more about servicing the steering and other units today.
Leave it to me, Ralph. I'll make route van specialists out of Pat, Art.
Attaboy, Tech. Go to it. I'll stick around and help you out.
Let's start with the front end, Tech. I got an idea it's going to be a rugged deal adjusting that new steering system.
For gosh sakes, Art. You're belly aching before you know what it's all about. Now listen. There's no basic change in the steering gear.
Right. On this light job, it's the regular worm and roller type with a ratio of 18.2 to 1. And on the other job, because you have heavier loads, you got a worm and sector type with a ratio of 23.2 to 1. Neither type's going to give you any headache. For instance, you know how to adjust for backlash, don't you?
Sure. For backlash and end play, you just use shims and the adjusting screw.
Right. That's all there is to it.
That stuff's in the shop manuals, isn't it, Tech?
Sure, Pat. But there is something new here. If you ever replace the steering column, you'll notice that the gear end is in a split housing.
That's so you won't strain the steering column when you tighten the brace between the column and the instrument panel.
I see what you mean. The elongated holes in the frame part of the housing let you fasten the housing to the frame and leave the stud nuts loose. Then, when you bolt the brace to the instrument panel, the column lines up with the frame mounting. Then you tighten the stud nuts. Right, Tech?
Right on the nose, Pat.
Sort of no strain, no pain deal, eh?
That's the idea, Art. Now let's get down to the steering linkage on this job. Do you fellas remember what I told you about it?
Let's see. They connect the steering gear arm to the knuckle arm with two drag links.
They do it that way so they can keep the front axle back where it belongs and still get the necessary leverage. Now the upper drag link runs from the steering gear arm to the idler arm. The lower drag link runs from the idler arm to the steering knuckle arm.
Correct, Art.
Those drag links are connected to the idler arm by insulated ball studs.
And the lower link is hooked up to the knuckle arm by a ball stud, too.
Sure. But the upper link is fastened to the steering gear arm by a split socket connection. If you ever have to adjust that connection...
I know. You screw the end plug in the socket till it's snug. Then you back off a quarter turn to the nearest cotter pin hole so you can lock the nut in position.
That linkage system is pretty good, Tech, but I'll bet a man has to be mighty careful about adjusting it.
You're not thinking while you're looking, Art.
If you look closely, Art, you'll see that the links can't be adjusted because the ball ends are welded to the tubes. But let's suppose a driver said his van wanders instead of staying on a straight course. If you got the job, you'd figure...
I'd figure the roller wasn't on the center point of the worm.
You'd be right, too. And here's what you'd do. First, you remove the steering gear arm from its shaft.
Wait till I get something to pry it off.
You don't pry it off, Art. There's a puller for pulling that arm. Go at it from the tool room. Oh, I know you got muscles, but let's take advantage of the tools we have, too.
That's the idea. And when you get that arm off, Pat can get in the van.
Yeah, I know. I count the number of turns the steering wheel makes in turning from the extreme left to the extreme right. Now I turn her back half that number of turns.
I see. That puts the steering gear shaft in the center of the worm.
Right. Now we set the wheels straight ahead.
I'm beginning to get it. We want the steering gear shaft centered, and at the same time we want the wheels straight ahead. So when we get those two positions right, we may have to reposition the steering gear arm on the splines of the roller shaft. That's why we pull the arm off first, huh?
Right, my boy. Now, suppose you hook it up.
Well, all I got to do is attach the arm to its shaft. There. The steering gear shaft is centered, and the wheels are straight ahead. Say, Tech, do you have to check wheel alignment when you're getting a new van ready for delivery?
Gosh, no. Keep your big mitts off those front ends. Caster, camber, kingpin inclination, toe out, all these things are set right at the factory.
Tech's got something there. When a van is new and stiff, you can't get a good reading anyway. There's only one steering adjustment you should make on a new van. You know what it is?
Well, towing is the only thing left. What say we check this job now?
We scribe a line around each tire instead of using a scuff board, right?
Right. What do you do next?
Well, now we measure the distance between the lines, front and rear. Set the gauge as near to the height of the hubcap as you can.
Came out with 1/8 of an inch toe-in. How's that check with the specifications for this job?
Just right, Art. But if it hadn't been, you'd have to loosen the tie rod end clamps and turn the tie rod.
Do you adjust toe-in on the heavy model the same way?
Nope. On the Model EU, the tie rod turns up at the ends in order to clear the springs. So, on the heavy model, you've got to disconnect the tie rod from the steering knuckle arm first.
Then you turn the tie rod end and tow them in not more than 1/8 of an inch, huh?
That's it. One turn of the ball end will change toe-in about 1/16 of an inch.
I guess that settles the front end. I gotta admit, I haven't seen anything that'll give us mechanics any new headaches. Now, Tech, how about stopping this van? Is there anything new about the brake system?
No, as long as you're familiar with hydraulic brakes. You won't have any trouble with the brakes on this job. Show them where they fill the master cylinder, Ralph.
Just remove this plate from under the accelerator. That's the master cylinder. It's easy enough to get at.
Sure enough. I suppose you go underneath if you have to remove it.
That's right, Art.
Say, Tech, what is this little switch for?
I was just waiting for you to ask that, Art. It's a switch for the brake lock.
The brake lock? You mean you can lock the hydraulic brakes instead of pulling on the handbrake?
Yeah, and it's a handy gadget. Easy to use and really holds the van, even on a hill.
I was going to say something about that, Tech. I saw the regular stoplight switch at the end of the master cylinder, and then there was another switch like it in the brake line just after the T connection.
That's right, Pat. But there's more to it than just a little diaphragm switch. I'll show you from this reference book just how the brake lock works.
Wait till I get somebody to turn the record over.
You fellas can figure out how this brake lock works. Look, there's a solenoid arrangement with the plunger acting as a check valve. When that plunger is closed, it keeps the brake fluid in the lines from returning to the master cylinder.
Oh, I see how it works. Look here, Art. When you step on the brake pedal and send fluid out to the brakes, the pressure of the fluid closes this switch just like the stoplight switch is closed. Then, when you snap this little toggle switch on, the circuit is completed to the solenoid, which draws the plunger in against its seat. That means the fluid in the brake lines can't get back into the master cylinder when you take your foot off the brake pedal.
Is the solenoid drawing current all the time the brakes are being held on?
No, Art. When you take your foot off the brake pedal, you relieve the fluid pressure against the switch. The switch opens, so the solenoid's no longer energized.
I see. Then, when you snap the toggle switch off, the solenoid plunger is released and is pushed off its seat by that little spring, so the fluid can get back to the master cylinder, huh?
No, it don't work like that, Art. There's so much pressure against the solenoid plunger that the little spring isn't strong enough to push the plunger off its seat.
Well, if cutting the current of the solenoid doesn't release the brake fluid, how do you get that check valve off its seat?
Very simple, my boy. You tell him, Ralph.
Well, the first thing is to cut off the switch. That'll keep the solenoid from being energized. Then, if you make the pressure on each side of the plunger equal, the spring will push the plunger off its seat. In order to do that, kick the brake pedal to build up the pressure on the master cylinder side of the plunger so the spring force it off its seat. Then the spring will hold it off.
You see, Art, if you didn't kick the brake pedal to equalize the pressure on each side of the plunger, you'd never get the brake lock to release.
What if the system got out of order and the valve stuck closed? Then you'd have to take it off to release it, I suppose.
No, Art. Because you can always kick up enough pressure with a brake pedal to shoot that plunger off its seat. Even if you had a breakdown in the diaphragm switch or the solenoid, you couldn't get stuck with the brakes locked on. Because with that kind of a failure, the brake lock wouldn't go on in the first place.
I see. And you could always replace the switch or the complete brake lock unit.
The only other thing that might happen is a failure of the van's electrical circuit, and that could be traced out.
Hey, you boys certainly figured that out all right. Now, let's get into the adjustment of the clutch linkage.
Brother, I was afraid you'd bring that up. With that engine setting way off to one side, why, I bet the clutch is controlled by radar.
Art, you'd suspect your mother of putting salt in the sugar bowl. Ralph, you show 'em how simple the clutch linkage really is.
In the first place, don't look for a clutch pedal stop screw. The floorboard stops the clutch pedal. Now, when you push down on the clutch pedal, you rotate the cross shaft. The cross shaft is connected to the clutch release forking shaft by this adjusting yoke arrangement.
Heck, Art, that linkage arrangement's simple enough.
Sure. I knew it would be all the time, but didn't Tech say some vans have fluid drive?
Yeah, some vans are equipped with fluid drive, Art, but there's not much difference in the linkage.
I suppose there'd be some change, though, because the fluid drive housing is longer than the conventional housing.
Sure, so they moved the number 2 frame cross member back a little.
Which means there's only a slight difference in the relative positions of the cross shaft and the release fork.
Well, then, the operation of the linkage is the same, so the slight change in position doesn't make any difference as far as adjustment is concerned.
The operation's the same. But what about the adjustment for free pedal play?
No difference, Art. All you do is turn the adjusting rod into the adjusting yoke enough to allow 1 inch of free pedal travel before the release bearing contacts the levers. And while we're on this subject, I want to tell you something about the operation of this van when it's equipped with fluid drive.
Go right ahead, boss.
First of all, Tech has told you some of these vans will have fluid drive. Since this is the first time fluid drive has ever been offered on a truck, you fellows will be talking to drivers who've never driven with fluid drive before. I want you to be able to give them the right story on how to use it in making their jobs easier. This unit isn't any different from the unit we've had in passenger cars for the past few years. You want to be sure to tell these drivers they should always start off in a lower gear because they'll be moving a pretty heavy load most of the time. Trying to start off in high will waste time and gas. And another thing, they'll be making a lot of stops in one block, so they can just leave the transmission in the lower gear all the time. Then they won't have to shift every time they want to move a few feet. It's all right to leave the transmission in gear and set the brakes while they're making a delivery to a house, like delivering milk or small packages. Then when they move on, they just flip the switch, kick the brake off, and step on the gas. Since the door-to-door drivers do most of their driving standing up, fluid drive makes this type of operation easy. You see, releasing the brake and stepping on the gas is a one-foot operation. There's no need to sit down and push the clutch pedal with the other foot and then shift gears. The driver simply walks in, flips the switch off, kicks the brake, moves ahead, stops, flips the switch on, and walks out. Now, on the conventional models, the driver has to sit down, release the brake, declutch, shift gears, clutch and accelerate, declutch, and so on for better than 10 operations. In other words, more than twice as many operations as required by fluid drive. So you see, fluid drive will save the driver a lot of time when he's covering his route.
In case you're wondering about whether too much heat will develop in that fluid drive unit and maybe cause damage, let me tell you this. The safety factors built into the unit will let the engine run at idle speed with the transmission in gear and the brakes set for as long as 2 hours without doing any harm.
Of course, if a driver's going to stop that long, like going to lunch, he'd naturally cut off the engine when he parked the van. Well, you fellas got any questions up to this point?
Nah, this job's not so tough for a couple of smart guys like me and Pat.
Yep. It took a lot of talking, boss, but we finally convinced Art that this route van won't be so tough for anybody to service once you get the hang of how it's made.
You've given us a lot of good dope, Ralph, and Tech says there's more coming.
You bet there is. I gotta give these fellas the lowdown on that rear wheel suspension. We'll have to get them together for another session pretty soon.
That's a good idea, Tech. We're going to sell a lot of these vans. And I want the boys to know all the answers so they can live up to our reputation for dependable Dodge service.